most DO students don't need to take USMLE. I know that makes me sound like a med school admin narc, but you gotta hear me out. I'm Dr. Lucas, former medical school professor, right? Not current, not actively a narc, and full-time board prep educator who's taken both exams and now tutors students through both. I'm going to explain exactly why most DOs are wasting their time and money taking USMLE, the 4 categories where it might actually matter, and how to decide if you're one of the rare cases where taking both makes sense. By the end, you'll know whether USMLE is worth the extra $1,000 in costs and months of stress that comes with it. Because let's face it, unless you have a very specific reason to take USMLE, you're making your life harder for programs that either don't care about it or won't interview you anyway. Let me start with the most important thing nobody tells DO students. USMLE is harder than COMLEX. Not just a little harder, significantly harder. But it's weird. It's not that the content is harder. It's about the same, and we'll talk about the differences later, but it's the competition that's harder. When I tutor DO students who want to take both exams, I always ask them this: how many Harvard med students go to your osteopathic medical school? Obviously, the answer is 0, because Harvard students go to Harvard and Hopkins students go to Hopkins. And all of those students are taking USMLE exclusively. So when you take USMLE as a DO student, you're not just being tested on the content, you're being ranked against the students who got into the most competitive med schools in the country. Let's say you're in the 15th percentile on COMLEX. Congrats, C's get degrees, you passed, and you'll probably match somewhere. But if you take USMLE, you might score in the 5th percentile and fail. Because there's so many ultra-competitive med students taking this exam and skewing the bell curve compared to COMLEX. Most of the students who come to me for tutoring are struggling with COMLEX. They're scoring in the 200s, 300s, or low 400s on ComSays, and many have already failed COMLEX at least once. And yet so many of these students tell me, but I'm also going to take USMLE because I want to keep my options open. But here's what happens. They try to study for both, and they use UWorld exclusively because it's the best question bank, and honestly, it 100% is. But in doing so, they neglect the COMLEX specific prep, and then they fail COMLEX. Or they barely pass COMLEX and fail USMLE. So if you're struggling with COMLEX, the exam designed for DO students, adding USMLE on top of it, it's just not realistic for most students in that situation. But don't worry, it's really not the end of the world. Now, I've also worked with a few students who are doing really well on ComSays, scoring in the high 400s or even 500s and beyond. These students wanted to take USMLE to apply to competitive specialties, and even they struggled a little bit to hit good NBME practice scores. The moral of the story is, if you're not crushing COMLEX, you're almost certainly going to struggle even more with USMLE. All right, let's talk about what these exams actually feel like on test day, because the differences aren't just about content. They're about question style, pacing, and how your brain actually has to process this information. So my personal story is that I took USMLE first, USMLE step 1 before COMLEX level 1. I figured if I could pass the harder exam, COMLEX would be a breeze. Wrong. I sat down for COMLEX level 1, opened the first block, and immediately thought, wait, where's the rest of the question? The questions were so much shorter than UWorld and USMLE. USMLE questions are these massive, heavily detailed vignettes, like a 45-year-old man with a history of hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and type 2 diabetes mellitus presents with substernal chest pressure radiating to the left arm associated with diaphoresis. Troponin is elevated, EKG shows ST segment elevations and leaves 2-3 ABF. Which of the following is the most appropriate next step? Whereas COMLEX questions are like, a 45-year-old man presents with chest discomfort. Vital signs are within normal limits. Which of the following is the most appropriate next step? That's it. That's the whole question. And then all 5 answer choices feel equally wrong. I was used to reading these long vignettes and skipping around the question stem to pull out key details, and that's part of my advanced question strategy that I still recommend to students today. But COMLEX questions were just so short and vague. I just read them, guessed, said a little prayer, and moved on. I finished the entire COMLEX exam 3 hours early, and I walked out thinking, did I just fail? Why did that feel so weird? I genuinely believed I failed level 1 because of how vague the questions were. USMLE gives you a ton of information. COMLEX gives you just enough to narrow it down to 3 possible answer choices. It felt like I was guessing on most questions, not because I didn't know the material, but because the question didn't give me enough information to be confident about it. Unlike on USMLE, where there was definitely enough information to be pretty confident about a diagnosis, and then either I did or did not know the pathophys when picking an answer. And as far as the actual content differences are concerned, For step 1 specifically, I studied a ton of embryology, biochemistry, and genetics for USMLE, and then COMLEX, it just seemed like it barely tested any of it. USMLE step 1 loves its niche basic science, whereas COMLEX really doesn't care as much. It tends to be more about the bigger picture. Are you sure enough what the diagnosis is? And if so, which answer choice most accurately describes the pathophys? So the takeaway is, if you're studying for both exams, understand that they're testing you in fundamentally different ways. USMLE wants precision, COMLEX wants big picture thinking. And if you only use UWorld to prep for COMLEX, you're going to be confused on test day just like I was. So you're still thinking, yeah, I probably want to take USMLE. That's totally fine. Let me tell you another story of mine that perfectly illustrates why most DOs still don't need USMLE. Even if it is safer to take it, you might not need it. Ortho is one of those ultra-competitive specialties where everyone says you need step scores to match. So I took both COMLEX and USMLE. Studied like crazy, definitely an unhealthy amount. And fortunately, I ended up with great scores on both. And then when I applied to ortho residencies, I forgot to submit my USMLE scores on ERAS. And that was not on purpose. I just messed up my ERAS application. And this is something I always warn people of because it's really easy to just forget to include your headshot, test scores, or even your letters of rec when you go to submit ERAS. Anyway, send in my application, no USMLE scores submitted to multiple ortho programs. I'm talking 50 plus, maybe even 100 of them. And you know what happened? Because of the volume, I still received multiple orthopedic surgery interviews at DO-friendly programs, especially at the ones I had already or was going to audition at. And I was actually ranked to match at a couple of them. So why is this? It's because DO-friendly programs care more about your audition performance than your USMLE score. During my ortho auditions, I made sure I knew more orthopedic surgery than any other med student on that rotation, especially the MD students, because the things about MDs and how they apply to residency is they're often competitive for residencies exclusively based on their USMLE scores. They show up to the auditions, do the bare minimum, not saying they're bad, they just don't necessarily have to put in as much work as we do on the auditions themselves to still match, because they'll match based on their 250 plus step 2 score. But DO-friendly residencies care more about if you get along well with the other residents and attendings. They also care more about if you take initiative on your rotation, helping out without being asked, but also without being overbearing, and learning as much as you possibly can. So that's what I did. I studied every night and prepared for the next day's surgical cases, even when I was exhausted. I also paid attention to what the residents were doing repeatedly so I could offer to do it for them once I had seen them do it a few times. And that's what got me ranked, not my USMLE scores that I forgot to submit. Now, I'm not saying all DO-friendly programs don't care about USMLE at all. Some programs might use it as a tiebreaker or prefer it to compare you to MD applicants easier. But the programs that do heavily weight USMLE scores are usually the MD exclusive residencies that probably won't interview you anyway, regardless of your USMLE scores, because you're a DO. Although it's definitely getting better, anti-DO sentiment still exists. It's not as prevalent in most primary care specialties, but it's still very noticeable in surgical specialties. Real quick, if you're sitting here thinking, okay, so should I take USMLE or not? I still don't know. Join the Pre-Educated Skool community. It's completely free. You get weekly live office hours and direct DM access to me so you can ask me questions about your situation, a growing library of 100 plus practice question breakdown videos, a community where DO and MD physicians answer your questions every day, study plan templates, and Anki decks based on some of my videos. The link's in the description. If you're trying to figure out your board prep strategy, this is the place to start. All right, I spent this whole video telling you why most DOs don't need USMLE, but let me be fair and tell you the 4 categories where it might actually matter. Number 1 is for ultra competitive specialties. If you want to do any of the road specialties or any surgical specialty, USMLE probably matters. I say probably because, remember my story, it really didn't matter because I put in a ton of work on auditions and applied to a bunch of DO-friendly residencies. Otherwise, these specialties are competitive enough that programs can afford to filter out applicants and may use USMLE scores as a screening tool to do so. Next up is academic programs. If you want to match at a big name academic institution like UCLA, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, then yes, USMLE definitely matters. These programs are almost 100% MD, expect USMLE scores, and use them to filter applicants. But again, these programs are very difficult for DO students to match into, even with excellent USMLE scores. It's possible if you're applying to a primary care field, but if you're a DO applying to a surgical subspecialty at Stanford, good luck. Number 3 is big cities. If you want to match in New York City, Los Angeles, or other major metropolitan areas, USMLE might help. Why? Because big cities have those big academic institutions we just talked about. It's a lot of overlap here. You know, the ones that are almost 100% MD. If you're applying to community programs or other DO-friendly programs that tend to be on the outskirts of those cities, USMLE probably doesn't matter as much. But it could still be useful just to bolster your application in case there aren't that many DO-friendly programs specifically where you want to go. Number 4, and probably the most common one, you don't know what you want to do yet. And that's okay. Some students say, I don't know what specialty I want yet, so I'm taking USMLE to keep my options open. And I totally get the logic, makes complete sense. If you're about to take your first board exam and you've been doing well in your preclinical courses and you aren't struggling with COMSAs, then yes, go for it. But we can break this down even further than that. Ask yourself this, do you want to do surgery or not? And try not to say yes just because you're clout chasing or you want to make a ton of money. If you do something you hate, no matter how prestigious or how much you'll be paid, you will burn out very quickly and have a short career. I heard a surgeon once say, to want to do surgery, you have to only like surgery. It takes many years of training, many missed birthday parties, and you will sacrifice a lot of mental and physical well-being to do it. Do you actually like the idea of standing in the OR all day, doing the same surgeries over and over? If all of that is still on the table, then yes, you probably should take USMLE. If you don't want to do any operating, or you just want to do smaller procedures like what's done in internal medicine and emergency medicine, but you just don't know specifically what specialty you want, you're probably cool not taking USMLE, so long as you don't fall into one of those other categories we just discussed. And if you don't end up taking step 1, you can always take step 2 later if your interests shift towards something more competitive during 3rd year. To clarify, you can submit a step 2 score without a step 1 score, but if you failed step 1, you cannot submit a passing step 2 score without that step 1 failure. You either have to submit all the USMLE exams you've taken or none of them. Now, the counter argument to that is some programs do want you to submit the full USMLE series, step 1 and step 2. And if you don't, they'll filter you out. My thought to that is, why? How DO-friendly can you really be if you have to have USMLE step 1 and 2 when step 1 is still just pass-fail? It just doesn't really make sense to me. So if you fall into one of those 4 categories, ask yourself, how am I scoring on COMLEX practice exams? Below 450 on COMSAs or below average on your timed question blocks and your question banks? You're going to have a tough time with USMLE. If you're 500 plus on COMSAs and you're crushing your practice question blocks, you might be ready for USMLE. So what's the backup plan if you do fail USMLE? Well, if you fail as a DO, again, you don't have to submit it. You can just submit your COMLEX score, but you still wasted months of your time and thousands of dollars registering for the exam. And that's what I'm trying to save you here. My recommendation is to default to COMLEX only. Master COMLEX first, get a solid passing score. Then, if you fall into one of the 4 categories and you're scoring well on NBME practice exams, add USMLE. But again, most DOs don't need it. And taking it doesn't automatically make you more competitive if you're applying to programs that either don't care about it or won't interview you anyway. I had a level 2 student who was really struggling with level 2. She wanted to do general surgery, and she ended up just barely scathing by on COMLEX. She passed first try, thankfully, and then she took step 2, and she also passed that, but barely, just a few points above what would be failing. I'm not sure if she ended up submitting her step 2 scores. I believe she did, but do you think general surgery residencies, the MD ones, are really looking at that score like, oh yeah, we got to take this one? So that's what I'm saying. Taking it doesn't necessarily make you more competitive. Now, I don't want anybody to just lose hope and say, oh my gosh, I wanted to be an ortho bro. I don't know what to do anymore after this video. Like, don't worry about it. You can always take practice NBME exams along the way while you're studying for COMLEX and see how you're doing. If your scores are trending up, if they're pretty good and they're looking like you're probably in range to pass, that's usually 65% correct to 70% plus is usually a good range for you to say that you'll pretty confidently pass USMLE if you take it. If your scores are looking good, just go for it. No problem. And the other thing is, again, since we don't need it to graduate and become physicians, you can always just postpone it if you need more time, or you can cancel it entirely. But I'm not saying give up on yourself. You can always see how you're doing along the way while you're prepping for COMLEX. I recently went to Arizona and gave a COMLEX Level 1 lecture series to a group of 140 osteopathic medical students at ATSU. They had some awesome questions that I hear all the time, and almost all of them were asking me one question in particular. And I'd be willing to bet you also have this question. Click the thumbnail on the screen now to find out what the 5 most common questions I was asked were. Now get out there and go donate some of your student loan money to the NBME.